Hey guys, tonight we're gonna walk through narrow cobbled alleys, past flickering lanterns and creaky wooden signs, into a world you probably weren't expecting. The sanctioned sin of medieval prostitution. Imagine the scent of damp hay, horse sweat, spilled ale, and something sweeter, cloying, maybe even floral. Perfume dabbed at the neck by candlelight. Somewhere nearby, a lute plays a clumsy tune, and behind a crooked door, carved with a heart and crossbones, history unfolds. This isn't the medieval world of solemn knights and silent monks you learned about in school. No, this is the underbelly, the smoky, velvet-draped rooms where pleasure had a price and the church sometimes held the receipt. You're standing in a medieval town just after sunset. The marketplace has quieted down and you follow a loose trail of laughter and faint singing. Chickens flutter away as your boots crunch down toward the stews, a common nickname for brothels thanks to their steamy origins near public bathhouses. The air here hums with mischief and musk. And now the reality check. You're in a society where disease is barely understood. Women have almost no legal power, and one poorly chosen client could spell your end. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Curious minds want to know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You press forward down a damp lane, glancing at worn signs hanging above thick wooden doors. A red scarf flutters from an upstairs window. A few women lean on a railing, laughing too loudly, brushing flour from their aprons. A clever act for anyone watching. Most of them aren't officially criminals. In fact, many are licensed by city officials, who pretend this is a kind of necessary evil. Here's the funny thing. The church wasn't just aware of this. It often participated in the regulation of sex work. In towns like Avignon, Toulouse, and even Rome, bishops worked alongside town councils to manage where, when, and how brothels operated. You might think that's shocking, but to medieval minds, it was just practical. They figured better to contain sin and pretend it didn't exist. So, cities created tolerance zones far enough from churches and noble homes, but close enough to attract traffic. These places were loud, colorful, and, depending on your luck, relatively safe. Prostitutes paid taxes. They submitted to health checks. Well, something resembling them. And they followed dress codes, a rule we'll get into more soon. You pass a wooden post with notices nailed to it. Some are laws, others are warnings. A few are written in Latin, but the gist is clear. Don't mess with the church's arrangements. Even brothels have curfews. One of the biggest names in this space was the south of France. In Avignon, home of the Pope for a time, the church's presence was massive, and oddly, so is its brothel network. Officials saw it as better to allow regulated sin than risk chaos. After all, how else would they keep the soldiers, pilgrims, and traveling merchants occupied? Even St. Augustine, yes, that Augustine, once wrote that without prostitution, society would crumble like a house without a sewer. Now, you walk past a door cracked open just enough to hear giggling. Inside, candlelight flickers against deep crimson drapes and low stools. There's a scent of warm wine and herbs, something like cloves. It masks other smells, less pleasant. The women here are young, not always by choice, and often deeply aware that their time in this trade is limited. You duck into a shadow and listen to a woman's voice float out from a window above. She's reciting something, not quite prayer, not quite poetry. It's a blend of charm and code. Many workers learned to speak multiple languages just to keep business flowing. Latin with a priest, German with a knight, Occitan with a merchant. And yet, beneath all this noise and perfume, danger always simmered. These alleys could be patrolled one night and lawless the next. Some brothel owners bribed local officials to look the other way. Others held blackmail secrets, maybe a priest's visit or a noble's child born of sin. Historians still argue whether this tolerance was motivated by compassion, greed, or simply resignation. The truth is probably some tangled mix of all three. You keep walking. A stray dog trails behind you. In the distance, a bell tolls for evening prayer, but no one here pauses. That bell may be sacred, but in this part of town, it simply marks the hour of business. One quirky little fact. Some brothels put actual signs outside their doors shaped like hearts, flowers, or animals. One famous place in London had a giant wooden boar hanging over the threshold. Locals called it the boar's head, but everyone knew what went on inside. As you turn a corner, a cart rattles past and a man in priest's robes rides alongside it. He doesn't stop or glance around, but you notice something peculiar. A folded parchment poking out from his satchel, an inspection record. He's heading to check on the brothel. Make sure the women are in order, whatever that means tonight. So here you are, shoulder to shoulder with medieval contradiction. A world where holiness and hunger danced uncomfortably close. And the path ahead? Oh, it only gets stranger. You follow that priest for a while, not closely, just enough to catch the swish of his robes and the cautious way he avoids eye contact with anyone lingering outside the brothels. His hood is pulled low. The cobblestones echo his deliberate steps. He doesn't seem eager to be seen, even though what he's doing is technically allowed. This is the odd paradox at the heart of it all. The medieval church, the towering authority on morality and salvation, quietly giving its blessing, or at least its shrug, to the oldest profession in the world. You duck into a recessed doorway, letting the priest pass, and glance up at a faded fresco just above you. It shows the Virgin Mary surrounded by angels. Below it, a wooden beam with fresh red paint. This door's marked as a house of tolerance. The contrast is almost poetic. So why would holy men, guardians of virtue, allow such things to exist? Simple. Because they were men, and men in positions of power, whether bishops, abbots, or inquisitors, had needs. Or at the very least, understood the needs of others. In many towns, church authorities were directly involved in regulating sex work. In places like Avignon, Toulouse, and Barcelona, the line between bishop and bureaucrat blurred. They issued licenses. They collected fines. They even designated safe areas for brothels, often in consultation with city councils. And sometimes, brace yourself, they kept the brothels on church-owned property. Rents had to be paid, after all. A cathedral needed new windows, didn't it? Now, historians still argue whether this was blatant hypocrisy or a twisted form of pragmatism. Maybe both. The church taught that fornication was a sin, yes, but also that it was less dangerous than rape, adultery, or sodomy. If you could contain lust, like putting a lid on a boiling pot. Maybe the rest of society wouldn't boil over. St. Thomas Aquinas, the intellectual giant of medieval theology, once wrote that prostitution in society was like a sewer in a palace. Disgusting, yes, but remove it, and the whole place starts to stink worse. You hear laughter behind you and turn to see a group of clergymen. Not high-ranking ones, more like scribes or young students, heading into a tavern next to a known brothel. They carry small purses, joke with one another, and one of them, you notice, has a rosary tucked beside his belt. None of them seem particularly troubled. A record from 13th century Paris includes a note from a bishop scolding his priests, not for visiting brothels, but for doing it too openly. "Bring less shame to your orders," he wrote. Translation: next time, be sneakier. Not all priests indulged, of course. Some were deeply ashamed of the arrangement. Others tried to reform it. But as you stand here listening to the night come alive with voices, you realize how embedded the practice was. This wasn't a fringe problem. It was part of the social order. Back in the day, church-endorsed penance manuals even included specific confession guidelines for prostitutes and their clients. How many times? With whom? For how much? It was almost like filing your taxes. One quirky tidbit. In Venice, some church officials reportedly wore disguises to frequent brothels, then later tried to shut those same places down in a kind of moral loop-de-loop. The townspeople didn't buy it, and neither should you. You move toward the main square, where a small chapel stands near the edge of the red light district. The contrast is jarring. Soft hymns inside, seductive coos just a few alleys over. Some prostitutes actually attended Mass daily. It was safer that way. Get seen praying, and people were less likely to accuse you of witchcraft or moral corruption, or at least not out loud. Occasionally, the priest or monk would fall in love with a prostitute, and sometimes, though rarely, he'd try to rescue her, offer her a different life. One chronicled story tells of a monk in Germany who brought a woman back to his abbey, disguised as a novice. It worked for several months, until someone noticed her laugh was a little too free. The punishment for clergy caught too deep in scandal varied widely. A slap on the wrist, a transfer, or, in extreme cases, excommunication. But honestly, if the priest was powerful enough, the church often looked the other way. Again. You find a quiet bench near the chapel and sit down. A stray cat curls near your feet. The moon is rising, turning the thatched rooftops silver. This is a city at peace with its contradictions. Morality preached at sunrise, relaxed by moonlight. One of the most telling artifacts from this period is a document from Avignon, a literal ledger of brothel incomes, expenses, and church tithes. It reads more like business accounting than spiritual oversight, and in the margins, notes on which rooms needed repair, which curtains had been replaced, which girls had left, married, or died. You close your eyes and let the scene drift around you. The murmurs of a client bargaining behind a wooden shutter. The distant clink of coins. A hymn echoing faintly through the chapel door. The scent of myrrh mixing with sweat and rose oil. The holy and the profane, stitched together with wax seals and handwritten permits. Now, let's be clear. Not everyone in the church approved. Some orders, like the Cistercians, were absolutely horrified by this leniency. They called for mass closures, public repentance, even exile for towns that allowed prostitution. But they were often overruled by pragmatists, and the economy had its demands. So here you sit, watching the edges blur. It's not just about sex or even sin. It's about power. Who gets to define it? Who gets to sell it? And who pretends it's not happening while collecting rent on the building? And the priest who passed you earlier, he never came back out. You get up from the bench and follow the road as it bends toward the riverside. The stones beneath your feet grow slick with evening mist, and soon the faint sound of water sloshing against wood fills your ears. You're approaching one of the busiest places in town. Not the market, not the docks, but the stew houses. Don't let the name fool you. These aren't restaurants. The word stew in the Middle Ages referred to the warm, watery atmosphere of public bathhouses, heated rooms with tubs, steam, and something more. You duck beneath a crooked timber archway where carved images of fish and fig leaves hint at what really happens inside. You step into one. Instantly, the heat wraps around you like a damp blanket. Everything glistens. Walls, skin, floorboards. The air smells of herbs, rosemary, thyme, maybe even lavender, an attempt to mask the more human scents drifting through the rooms. Women laugh softly in corners, their bare arms glinting with moisture as they ladle water into basins. It's not technically a brothel. Not on paper, but everyone knows what goes on here. These bathhouses were where business blurred with pleasure. Clients came for a scrub and sometimes stayed for far more. And the church? Well, it tolerated it, mostly, because bathhouses, unlike street corners, could be regulated, supervised, even taxed. And here's a weird detail. In some cities, bathhouses were required to hang flags outside. White if they were clean, red if they served other purposes. It was a traffic light system for vice. Makes you wonder who came up with that one. A man walks past, towel around his neck, whistling. He's wearing a merchant's chain. He'll go back to his family tomorrow, but tonight he's anonymous. The women here are discreet. Many of them work only a few years, then vanish into quiet marriages or religious orders. Some, though, stay, moving up the ranks to become bathhouse managers or hostesses, which is medieval code for she runs everything. ... One of these women passes you now, mid-40s, sharp eyes, simple dress, but gold rings on 2 fingers. She's carrying a small scroll tucked into her apron, probably the list of visitors for the evening. You wonder if a bishop's name might be on it. You wouldn't be surprised. Historians still argue whether bathhouses were safer for women than brothels. On the one hand, they offered more structure, sometimes better wages, and less isolation. On the other hand, they often doubled as places for medical procedures, Yes, even abortions, and some clients were known for violence. You trail behind the hostess as she checks on a room where two women laugh over a wine jug draped in towels. One has a small tattoo of a star on her shoulder, a sign of ownership from years ago, perhaps. Tattoos weren't common in the Middle Ages, but among the enslaved or marked classes, they cropped up. Not all prostitutes were free. A quick aside. In London's Southwark district, the Church of Winchester owned dozens of bathhouses and brothels. The women who worked there were nicknamed Winchester geese. Cute, right? Until you learn they were buried in unconsecrated ground, in what became known as the Crossbones Graveyard. Their souls weren't welcome in heaven, even if their earnings helped build the cathedral. Back in the steamy chamber, a young girl, maybe 16, brings fresh linens. She looks exhausted. Some started working here as assistants, only to be drawn deeper in by poverty or pressure, or promises. It's quiet, but you can almost hear the long, slow erosion of choice. The bathhouse smells oddly familiar now, almost like eucalyptus. You remember that smell from spa products at your local grocery store. Funny how little changes. Heat, oil, a little privacy. The human body, scrubbed clean, were sold off. One of the most chilling records from the time describes how stew houses were inspected by both city officials and churchmen of reputation. Their job? To make sure things were orderly. No more than 5 women per house. No violent men inside. No theft. And nothing unnatural. A word the Middle Ages loved to use without ever defining it clearly. One quirky fact you can't unsee. Some bathhouses used music. Live lute players. Even early versions of what we'd call spa soundscapes to set the mood. The goal wasn't just seduction, but comfort. If clients stayed longer, they paid more. You step into a changing area where garments hang on hooks. Many are men's. You scan the initials stitched into collars. One has a crest, a noble family maybe. Another bears a cross embroidered in red silk, a monk's robe. The hypocrisy is almost artistic. And yet, for all its contradictions, this world thrived. Women fed their children this way. Some bought property. Others supported entire families while pretending to be seamstresses. Bathhouses blurred lines, not just between clean and unclean, but between survival and scandal. You leave through a back door and find yourself near the water again. The moon's higher now, casting silver streaks across the river. Behind you, the stew house glows like a lantern. Somewhere inside, a man laughs, a woman sings, and a deal is struck over a warm basin of perfumed water. It's easy to judge from a distance, but here, in the thick of it, things feel practical. Sad, sure, sometimes exploitative, but also fiercely human. And the church? Still collecting its share, one quiet coin at a time. You wake up early the next morning, slipping through narrow streets as the mist begins to rise. Bakers stoke ovens. Stable boys yawn. But down a particular alley, the one you now recognize by its quiet hush and the faded scent of last night's perfume, there's something else beginning. A queue. Not of clients, but of women. Standing in a crooked line, cloaks pulled tight, avoiding one another's eyes. Each clutches a folded slip of parchment. You step closer and see the painted symbol above the door. A small red chalice dripping 3 stylized drops. This is the licensing office. Yes, in many medieval towns, Avignon, Toulouse, London, and a dozen more, prostitution wasn't just tolerated. It was licensed, official, documented, controlled. And right now, you're watching sin get registered like sheep at a market fair. Each woman steps forward and hands her parchment to a clerk, usually a church-appointed scribe or a town bailiff, who writes something in a heavy ledger. A few coins change hands. The scribe nods. A seal is pressed into soft wax. Done. Congratulations, she's now a licensed prostitute. And oddly, that's safer than being unlicensed. In theory, it meant she could work in designated areas without harassment, receive some kind of protection, and, ironically, avoid the charge of being a public scandal. Let's pause there. The logic was this. If you worked in secret, you were dangerous. You might lure married men, spread disease, or disrupt social order. But if you were regulated, known, taxed, tagged, you became part of the town's infrastructure. Clean sin, filed under necessary expenses. Historians still debate whether this licensing was empowering or degrading. On one hand, it gave some women legal standing. On the other, it was deeply transactional, reducing the body to lines in a ledger and coins in a dish. One quirky rule from the town of Dijon: licensed prostitutes were forbidden from wearing gold. Too showy. It gave the impression of success, and the church thought that might encourage others to join. Can't have that. You follow one woman as she exits the building. Her face is blank. She tucks the license into her bodice and heads down the road toward the stewhouse quarter. Her pace is steady, not hurried. This is routine. It happens weekly in some cities. You notice that her shoes are worn, but her cloak is new, stitched recently, probably secondhand from a wealthy donor. Some churches donated clothing to prostitutes, not out of kindness exactly, but to maintain public modesty. Never mind the irony. Behind her, another woman exits, younger. She wears a badge on her shoulder, a striped patch of cloth in yellow and blue. That's not a fashion choice. It's a legal marker. In many towns, prostitutes were required to dress in ways that signaled their status. Yellow was common. In some places, it was a hood. In others, a sash, a ribbon, or even special boots. You walk a bit farther and notice something interesting. The tailoring has improved. One woman wears a full yellow dress, but it's finely cut. The hem is embroidered. She's made the badge into a brand. And that, right there, is a quiet rebellion. These laws were supposed to shame, to mark these women as fallen. But some turned it into style. If you're going to be forced to wear a sign, why not make it silk? Why not turn heads? Of course, not everyone saw it that way. City laws were clear. If you were caught without your badge, or working outside the red light district, you could be fined, imprisoned, even whipped. One woman in Toulouse was arrested for wearing a nun's veil to a feast. She'd borrowed it from a friend to blend in. When discovered, she claimed she just wanted to feel invisible for a night. The court sentenced her to public penance. A bishop, watching the punishment, reportedly muttered, Even sin wants sanctuary. Some women did, in fact, work for sanctuary, literally. Licensed prostitutes who reached old age or could no longer work sometimes entered convents, either voluntarily or through charity. A few convents even specialized in such redemptions. Whether it was salvation or PR for the church is another matter. But today, most just keep moving. You cross paths with a city guard as you head back toward the main road. He carries a list of names, those with current licenses, and those delinquent on their fees. The church gets its cut. The town gets its share. Everyone's happy, as long as everyone pays. And here's a strange fact. In some towns, the church used part of the revenue from brothel taxes to fund hospitals. The argument was simple. Vice caused illness, so vice should pay for healing. Sin as social policy. You pass another building now, this one with a high wooden fence and a small stained glass window tucked above the door. It's a chapel. Inside, a priest delivers morning mass. And guess who's in attendance? A handful of the same women from the license queue. Hooded, quiet, hands folded. Maybe they're here for forgiveness. Maybe they're hedging bets. Or maybe they just like the smell of incense and the steady rhythm of the prayers. You step inside too, standing in the back, letting the chant wash over you. The priest makes no mention of sin, or virtue, or shame. Just Psalm 23, soft and slow. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And in that moment, everyone in the room, priest, penitent, prostitute, is just another soul trying to survive. You slip back outside, the chapel's cool shadows still clinging to your cloak, and follow the narrow side street as it curves into a smaller courtyard. A wooden sign above a door creaks in the breeze. 2 coins, crossed like swords, painted beside a pale red flower. It's not a shop, not exactly. Inside, the air is still, heavy with the smell of beeswax, dust, and something metallic, like old copper or iron. You wait quietly as a young man exits the back room, adjusting his belt and tossing a coin onto a tray near the entrance. The door swings shut behind him. You step inside. The woman who runs this place is older, her hair streaked with gray, her hands surprisingly soft. She glances at you, then back down at her ledger. She's not a prostitute. She's a broker, a madam. And this place, it's a specialty house. One of the oldest tricks in the book. This establishment, discreet, expensive, and whisper quiet, caters to those seeking what they can't get anywhere else. Firsts. You watch as a girl no older than 17 appears behind a beaded curtain. Her eyes are tired, but she smiles. She wears no badge. That's intentional. This house, like many in medieval Europe, operates on a secret and troubling economy: virginity. The church said sex was only moral inside marriage, but outside those walls, virginity still held immense value, even if it was sold. Here's where things get murky. In medieval towns, virgin prostitutes fetched the highest prices. Not just because of purity myths, but because of bizarre medical beliefs. Some clients thought sleeping with a virgin could cure disease, especially venereal ones. Others believed it brought luck, protection in battle, long life. Historians still argue whether these houses exploited desperate girls, or if some young women actively chose their first client in hopes of better treatment. But one thing's clear: the church knew about this economy, and often it did nothing to stop it. In fact, records from Barcelona show that city officials, not priests, not nobles, but clerks, oversaw first-time sales. In one case, the town paid a fee to ensure a girl's virginity was deflowered in town, not sold off to a traveling merchant. The logic? Better to keep the money local. You pause by a window and peer out. Down in the courtyard, a man in furs lights a small brazier and warms his hands. He's a minor noble. His carriage waits nearby. He's here for something transactional, and he likely has church protection. One quirky fact: in some towns, if a client couldn't afford a virgin, he could sponsor her. That is, pay her rent, offer protection, and in return, claim rights to her first time. Romantic? No. Legal? Sort of. The transaction was often overseen by church-appointed notaries. You think of them now, sitting behind desks, pens scratching on parchment, sealing contracts for sins they'd condemn from the pulpit. Some girls tried to fake virginity. There were potions, rituals, even staged bleeding, red berries crushed into linens. In Venice, one court case records a woman who faked it 6 times before being caught. The judge was furious, not because of the deception, but because it made fools of the clients. Priorities. You step back as a curtain rustles. The girl with tired eyes is gone. Another takes her place. She's older, confident, a kind of manager now. She offers you wine and gestures toward the books on the nearby shelf. Not baubles. These are ledgers, contracts, receipts. This house is run like a guild. Structured, efficient, ruthless. Historians still can't agree whether these high-end brothels were secretly admired by the church, or whether they simply escaped notice thanks to careful bribes and even more careful silence. One bishop in Vienna famously allowed them to operate so long as their taxes went toward rebuilding the cathedral's roof. A joke later circulated: the steeple was built on backs that bent beneath it. You leave the house quietly, the door shutting with a low click. The wind picks up. You pull your cloak tighter. Out here, the world feels sharper than it did inside. You pass a group of boys tossing dice, their voices high and careless. They're too young to know what's happening. 2 doors down. Or maybe they know and just don't care. Either way, they'll learn. You follow the alley past a series of windows shuttered tight. But behind one, a candle still burns. A woman hums softly, brushing her hair. She's alone, maybe preparing for someone, maybe waiting, or maybe just trying to feel human again. There were women who refused the virgin trade. Some stood their ground, even if it meant losing money or protection. A few tried to form informal alliances, early unions of sorts, strength in numbers, but power rarely lasted. The system was too entrenched, and the church, occasionally, it made gestures, called for investigations, issued statements, but rarely followed through. So here you are, in a town that claims to serve God, And yet, tucked behind the stone walls and stained glass, there's an entire economy of first times, last chances, and unspoken prayers. Some sold what they had, others bought what they believed they needed, and the ledgers kept growing. You wake the next morning to the sound of bells echoing through the stone alleys, somewhere between a call to prayer and a call to order. The city is stirring again, vendors shout, hooves clatter, and just ahead in the open square, a new kind of performance begins. Women walk slowly through the crowd, shoulders squared, eyes fixed ahead. Each one wears something striking: a striped hood, a golden ribbon, a yellow cloak. No, this isn't a fashion parade. It's medieval law, stitched into fabric. You're watching a regulation unfold in real time, a living taxonomy of shame. In towns across Europe, prostitutes were legally required to mark themselves with certain colors or garments. The rationale? So decent women wouldn't be confused with those who sold their company. You step into the crowd and watch the parade pass. A girl with a yellow belt adjusts it nervously. Another with a red stripe along her hem walks a little faster, pretending not to hear the whispers from two older women behind a bread stall. The rule book was different from city to city. In Venice, they had to wear red. In Paris, striped hoods. In Barcelona, a yellow veil. One London ordinance demanded women wear striped sleeves that could be seen from afar, even in rain or fog. The church claimed this was for moral clarity. Of course, it also helped with tax enforcement. Easy to know who owed what when their job was literally walking around labeled. And yet, humans being humans, something unexpected happened. Fashion. Some women took the rules and twisted them into flair. Yellow cloaks became velvet. Stripes became embroidery. If you were going to be marked, you might as well be magnificent. One woman in Avignon became famous for her golden stitched hood. So elaborate, so expensive, that noble women tried to copy it. City Council was not amused. Historians still argue whether this trend was resistance, resignation, or simply pragmatism. Maybe all three. Maybe it was just a way to feel visible on your own terms. You watch as the procession breaks. Some women duck into alleyways. Others head toward the brothel quarter. One leans against a post and lights a small twist of herbs. Smoke curls around her face as she watches the crowd watch her. You approach a nearby notice board. Parchments hang by nails, fluttering in the breeze. Some are laws, others are punishments. One reads, "Let it be known that any woman of the streets found without proper badge shall be fined 5 deniers and flogged on the 3rd day." Harsh, but predictable. Then you see something stranger. A local guild posting offering discounted fabric, yellow of course, for any woman in the public service. The city literally subsidized shameware. You turn the corner and find a tailor's shop. Inside, a girl is being measured while her mother negotiates. The fabric is dull. The stitching is rough. But the girl holds herself steady. This is her first uniform. Not school. Not church. Work. She won't wear it forever. Most didn't. Many tried to escape the trade within a few years, through marriage, religion, or sheer luck. But for now, she's following the rules, keeping herself visible so she doesn't get dragged to court. You hear a rustle behind you. and turn to see a woman tugging off her hood. She folds it quickly, slipping into a bakery where a group of mothers gossip over loaves. She wants 10 minutes of peace, just long enough to feel like anyone else. Of course, if a city guard walks by and sees her, she'll be fined, or worse. And yet some took that risk every day. You follow a narrow bridge over the canal and reach a quieter part of town. Here, close lines stretch between windows, dripping yellow and red. The air smells like soap and spring grass. You glance up and see a strange sight. A child's tunic, dyed the same bright yellow as the working women's cloaks. Accident? Maybe. But something tells you that child's mother used what she had. You pause on the bridge, watching ripples in the water. It's peaceful here, but even now, you can sense the tension beneath it all. The daily performance of legality. The quiet acts of rebellion stitched into every hem and hood. There's a church bell in the distance. Time for midday prayer. And still, just beyond the cathedral steps, a woman leans on a post, her golden hood glowing in the sun, catching the eye of every passerby. Is she advertising, surviving, protesting, or simply showing the world that even marked women can be seen in daylight? One quirky tale survives from Milan. A wealthy merchant fell in love with a prostitute, known for her elaborate yellow gloves. After months of courting, he offered marriage. She agreed on one condition. He must wear her gloves to their wedding. He did. The bishop choked. The town roared. So yes, the church could mandate color. It could enforce borders, but it could never quite predict how people would wear them. You step off the bridge and head toward the old tannery district, where more stories and stranger contradictions await. You turn onto a quieter street now, the bustle of the market fading behind you, replaced by the low hum of voices and the occasional creak of iron hinges. Ahead looms a small, worn chapel, its doorway crooked, its bell cracked. And yet, people line up outside it, not to attend Mass, but to kneel beside the confession booth. You find a shadowy corner inside and watch as one woman steps forward. She wears the telltale yellow sash, her shoulders stiff. She crosses herself and disappears behind the curtain. A moment later, the muffled exchange begins. Words low, tone hushed. This is where it gets personal. In medieval cities, prostitutes were not excluded from confession. In fact, they were often encouraged to attend regularly, sometimes even compelled to, especially during high holidays. You shift closer, the scent of old wax and damp stone thick in the air. On the other side of the wooden partition, the priest sits silently for a moment. You imagine the weight of what he hears day after day. How many? Did you enjoy it? Did you take money on holy days? Did you lie about being clean? Did he pay? Confession was meant to cleanse the soul, but for many, it was also an uncomfortable ledger of transactions. Now, imagine being the priest. You're bound by duty, by theology, by rules that say you must absolve the penitent, but also scold, instruct, and redirect. But what if the woman confessing has no other options? What if she's doing what she must to eat, to survive, to protect her children? Historians still argue whether medieval confession was a source of spiritual relief or just another layer of control. For some, it was both. For others, it was the one moment they could speak freely, understood if not forgiven. There's a story from Cologne, 1322. A woman known as Elizabeth the Candlekeeper confessed every Friday without fail. Her priest, sympathetic, began giving her leftover altar bread. Eventually, she moved into a small room behind the church. Not exactly sainthood, but survival facilitated by faith. You exit the chapel and head down the side alley. A young man in clerical robes passes you, head lowered. He's no older than 20. As he vanishes into the crowd, you wonder if he's headed toward the same brothel he'll later hear confessions about. It happened. More than you'd think. There are documents, actual handwritten testimonies of priests who frequented the very establishments they then preached against. Some even offered discounted penance in exchange for services. Others kept detailed logs of which women they preferred and when. In Siena, a bishop once accused his own priesthood of being too familiar with the perfumed doors of sin. The scandal rocked the town. The bishop was reassigned, quietly. One quirky account from Bohemia tells of a confessor who fell in love with a woman he was meant to spiritually rehabilitate. He tried to convince her to leave the profession and run away with him. She agreed, then took his money and stayed. Oops. Of course, not every priest was corrupt. Some truly believed in redemption. A few even risked their positions to protect women from violent clients or to speak against city laws they believed too cruel. You reach a crossroads where 4 streets meet under the shadow of an enormous cross erected by the Dominican order. At its base, someone has left offerings: bread, a few dried flowers, even a yellow ribbon. A quiet nod, maybe, to those caught between judgment and grace. You sit on a low wall beside the shrine. The wind brushes through the alley, carrying the scent of incense from a nearby chapel, and something sharper, earthier. A butcher's shop, maybe. This is the crossroads where sin meets salvation. And no one, not priest, not prostitute, not penitent, is quite certain which direction they're truly facing. You watch as a woman approaches the cross. She kneels. She doesn't pray. She just rests her head against the stone for a moment, then stands and walks away. Was she seeking forgiveness, or simply a pause in the constant noise of being judged? It's easy to romanticize confession as healing, but for these women, it was often a weekly ritual of reminders. You are impure. You are tolerated, but not accepted. You are necessary, but not embraced. And yet, many went back, week after week, hoping for mercy, for peace, for one moment where someone listened without reaching for a coin or a punishment. Sometimes they got it. Other times, the priest fell asleep. It happens. So here you sit, at the edge of old stone, where sins are tallied in whispers and absolutions are handed out like reluctant breadcrumbs. And the candle still burns inside the booth, steady, flickering, and just bright enough to illuminate both the shame and the survival. You rise from the stone ledge and follow the street as it coils downhill, past weavers hanging dyed cloth and children chasing chickens with sticks. It smells of smoke and starch, fried onions and wet wool. And then, through a crooked archway, you enter a different kind of district. Cheerful vendors here, just shuttered windows, cobbles slick with spilled wine, and the faint sound of a lute drifting from somewhere behind a closed door. Welcome to the official red light district. Yes, official. You might imagine these areas formed naturally by rumor or convenience, but in many medieval cities, red light districts were deliberately planned. The church, the city council, and local merchants sat down, sometimes literally around a table, and decided, this street here, yes. That alley, no. Keep it contained. Keep it quiet. You pass a sign carved into a doorpost, a rose, barely visible under centuries of scratches, a symbol. Subtle, but unmistakable. One door opens just slightly as you pass. A woman peers out, middle-aged, alert, not a working girl anymore, likely a house mistress. She gives you a quick once-over before retreating. Behind her, you catch a glimpse of someone dancing slowly in the shadows. This area has rules. In some cities, brothel hours were regulated. No business during church services. No soliciting after curfew. No disturbing the peace. Unless, of course, the client was wealthy, in which case exceptions could be made. Naturally, one quirky ordinance from Strasbourg even laid out specific street hours for different social classes. Nobles came early, tradesmen later, clerics, allegedly, on lunch breaks. You walk a little farther and pause by a fountain. Its basin is chipped. A pigeon pecks at the rim. You read an old inscription on the wall nearby, barely legible. Let not vice spill past this stone. A physical boundary for sin. How tidy, how quaint. The theory behind red light zoning was simple. Contain the moral infection to one part of town, like quarantining a disease. That way, respectable wives and daughters could walk the streets unbothered. That way, the church could say, see, we're in control. Historians still argue whether these districts protected or harmed the women who worked in them. On one hand, the rules reduced random arrests and offered a small sense of order. On the other, they marked the women as permanent outsiders. You could work your whole life here and still be denied burial in sacred ground. You duck under a laundry line as a woman tosses water from a window above. She's humming. Her sleeves are rolled high and she wears no badge. Some brothel workers lived full-time in their places of work. Others rented small apartments nearby and maintained a fragile separation between their public and private lives. The church often inspected these houses, not always for moral reasons, but for financial ones. Had they paid their taxes? Were they harboring unlicensed workers? Were any of the girls underage, or foreign, or worse, pregnant? Yes, pregnancy was bad for business. Some women who became pregnant tried to keep working, hiding the swelling under loose gowns. Others were cast out. A few were married off in hush-hush deals to low-ranking guards or old clients. And some pregnancies, well, they ended quietly, behind closed doors, with a midwife's help. You turn a corner and arrive at what used to be the heart of the district, a square courtyard, now empty, save for a broken bench and a rusted lantern swinging from an old beam. But you can feel what it once was. The voices, the the footsteps, the deals. In London, the area of Southwark functioned like this for centuries. The Bishop of Winchester owned the land. The prostitutes paid rent. The church made money. And everyone pretended virtue still reigned across the river. They were even called Winchester's geese. A ledger from 1364 lists repairs to a Southwark brothel roof, paid for by the bishop's estate. The same estate, funding scholarships for choir boys. The same estate, paying for altar candles. You sit on the bench and stare at the lantern. This district wasn't lawless. It had rules. It had structure. But it was always temporary. Always one whisper, one scandal, one new bishop away from closure. The women here knew that. They lived with one foot on the cobblestones and the other on shifting sand. You hear the click of shoes behind you, hard soles. A man walks through the square, glancing briefly into windows, hat tilted low. He's not from here. A visitor, a client, or maybe a priest. It can be hard to tell. You rise and follow him a few paces before stopping. No need to go further. You've seen enough. The district remains. Even now, centuries later, its ghost lingers. In the shape of the alleyways, in the discoloration of the walls, in the strange silence that still holds after dark, and in the records, always the records. Rent rolls, tax lists, confession notes, all the invisible ledgers of human need. You step through the arch that separates the red light district from the main square. Just beyond it, the world resumes its familiar rhythm. Townsfolk hawking herbs, monks haggling over parchment, boys chasing carts down the street. A blur of normal, respectable, official. But look closely, just under the surface, and you'll see something peculiar. There's a procession winding through the square, a parade of sorts, led by a group of priests. Not unusual, they're chanting, holding relics aloft, incense drifting in thick spirals above the crowd. Behind them, a few city officials. Behind them, women. Not noble women, not nuns, but prostitutes. It's not a shaming ritual, though you'd think so. These women aren't being punished. They're participating in something far stranger, a religious festival. Because yes, in several medieval cities, prostitutes were required or invited, depending on your perspective, to take part in public religious ceremonies. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine spiritual inclusion, a performance of repentance, or simply civic theater. Maybe a bit of all three. You fall into step beside the procession. One woman carries a candle nearly as tall as she is. Another holds a crude wooden cross. Their yellow hoods flutter in the breeze, but their faces remain composed, unreadable. Take Barcelona, for example. Prostitutes were expected to process on feast days in special clothing. Sometimes barefoot, sometimes veiled. They walked behind the clergy, always behind, but present. And in Venice, there was an annual ritual in which prostitutes would gather outside a church and hand over alms, coins they'd collected throughout the year, to fund masses for their souls. The spectacle was solemn, but the message was layered. You are sinful, but useful. You watch now as the women arrive at the cathedral steps. A priest sprinkles holy water. A bell rings. The crowd watches, not quite jeering, not quite welcoming, just observing. A strange detail from Paris. One bishop insisted that prostitutes attend Mass separately, in a side chapel, roped off from the rest of the congregation. They were there, but not there. Included, but not embraced. And yet, others found ways to push back. You spot one woman in the crowd wearing her yellow hood, but beneath it, a necklace with a small silver crucifix. It's simple, but finely made. Perhaps a gift. Perhaps bought with coin earned from work the church officially condemned. It's not a contradiction. It's survival. There were even religious orders founded by former prostitutes, small, radical communities of women who had left the trade and committed themselves to prayer. One such group in 14th century Florence called themselves the Sisters of Repentance and lived in a crumbling villa on the edge of town. They wore black. They took in orphans, and they kept their doors locked tight to men. You circle the cathedral now and find a quieter chapel off to the side. Inside, a statue of the Virgin Mary gazes down, her expression calm and unreadable. At her feet, candles, ribbons, scraps of fabric, and, tucked just behind the altar, a small note written in Latin, barely legible. Mary, who heard no sin, but saw it all, help me. You lean back against the wall. The incense still clings to your cloak. The air is heavy with devotion, but it's not the kind that comforts. It's the kind that complicates, that twists and curls like smoke, never settling in one place. One quirky fact. In some towns, prostitutes paid to have statues of saints installed outside their brothels, a kind of spiritual insurance. If heaven was watching, best to provide seating. You step outside again. The square is quieter now. The procession has ended. A few yellow-cloaked women duck into alleyways, their religious duties fulfilled for the day. You pause at the cathedral doors, where a stone plaque reads, "Mercy is for all." But some must ask louder. You wonder who carved it, and if they ever meant it. You drift away from the cathedral, moving down a quieter lane where the sound of sandals on stone fades into the soft whisper of turning pages. Ahead, nestled between two wine shops, is an unassuming building with a slate roof and a crooked chimney. No signs, no bells, but inside, a library. Not the kind open to the public, mind you. This one belongs to the bishop's office. You ease the heavy door open and slip into the stillness. A clerk looks up, squints at you, then goes back to cataloging. Good. That means you're invisible. The room smells of vellum and candle wax, with a trace of damp, like old secrets left in the rain. Shelves stretch along the walls, their contents carefully labeled. You walk slowly along one row, your fingers brushing cracked spines. Canon law, moral treatises, taxation ledgers, and there, tucked sideways, registers of public women. You pull it out. Yes, they kept actual books, detailed records, listing names, locations, payment histories, and notes on behavior. The state tracked vice the way a merchant tracks grain. Some cities were meticulous. Venice, for instance, kept brothel logs with information on which women had licenses, which had lapsed, which had debts, and which had died. Cross-referenced with church payments, of course. You flip through one of the pages. The ink has faded, but the names remain. Agnes of the West Gate. Paid in full. Joan of the Stables. Warning issued. Mariette expelled for seducing a married knight. That last one is underlined twice. One quirky note. In Avignon, scribes sometimes included descriptions of the women, as if compiling a twisted version of a dating service. Tall, missing teeth, gentle, fond of music. You wonder if the entries were meant for record-keeping or private enjoyment. Historians still argue whether these records were strictly bureaucratic or quietly voyeuristic. You suspect the answer depends on who was writing them. You flip forward and find an addendum. Petition for license rejected, known to have pox. Venereal disease was a major concern, and in the absence of modern medicine, regulation became the closest thing to prevention. If a woman was suspected of carrying disease, she could be denied work, fined, even imprisoned. Some were banished entirely, others sent to hospitals run by religious orders. You turn the page again and freeze. There, in looping, careful script, Benedetta of San Luca, license suspended, entered the convent of St. Anne by bishop's arrangement. So there it is, the pipeline. Some women disappeared from these records, not because they died or ran, but because they were absorbed into the church itself. Yes, truly. A number of convents across Europe quietly took in former prostitutes. Some offered a genuine path to redemption. Others, frankly, just needed the labor. You pause and lean back against the dusty shelf, remembering a case from the city of Speyer. 3 women, formerly of the brothel quarter, entered a convent after being reclaimed by a particularly zealous priest. But the local townspeople objected. Letters were sent. The bishop intervened. Why? Because they feared impure souls would taint the sanctity of the sisterhood. The 3 women were reassigned as laundresses. They were in the convent, but never of it. You return the register to its shelf and wander deeper into the archive. Another room opens up, dimly lit. A clerk naps at his desk, quill still in hand. You pass him and find a locked cabinet, its key forgotten in the door. Inside, confiscated materials, banned books, pamphlets, personal letters. You gently open a small booklet labeled Correspondence, Pious Women and Their Confessors. You scan a few pages. Most are mundane, but one stops you cold. A letter written in delicate Latin from a woman to her priest. You say I am lost, but I am only wandering. You say I am stained, but I am made of salt and blood and wind. Do not tell me of purity. Tell me of mercy. You fold the paper closed, suddenly aware of the silence around you. What you've uncovered here isn't just history. It's bureaucracy wrapped around morality. A paper trail of compromise, exploitation, and the desperate need to make sin manageable. And the church? It kept these books not to remember the women, but to manage them, track them, control them. You exit the library quietly, the door creaking behind you. The sunlight is brighter than expected. Outside, a child runs by holding a painted ribbon, yellow and red stripes. You wonder if she knows what those colors once meant. You hope she never has to. You follow a winding road now, away from the center of town, up toward the hill that overlooks the city walls. The cobbles thin out here, replaced by dry grass and gravel. It's quieter, fewer footsteps, fewer eyes. This is where the Magdalene houses stood. Not quite convents, not quite prisons, but certainly something in between. They were founded in the name of redemption, often with church backing, sometimes by rich widows looking to secure a shortcut to heaven. Officially, they were refuges for fallen women. Unofficially, somewhere to tuck them out of sight. You arrive at one such house. The iron gate creaks as you push through. Vines creep up its walls. A small wooden cross is nailed beside the door. You knock, but no one answers. Still, the door yields. Inside, it smells of lavender, stale bread, and old stone. This place once held dozens. Some stayed willingly. Others were sent here after arrest, or by a priest, or even by their own families, ashamed of a pregnancy, or rumors, or simply a daughter's defiance. You walk past rows of narrow wooden beds, each with a worn woolen blanket folded neatly. No decoration, no mirrors. One small window lets in light from the east. On the wall hangs an old painting of Mary Magdalene. Not radiant, not triumphant, just tired. Her face is shadowed, her hands folded tightly over her heart. She looks like she wants to disappear. And here's the strange thing. Magdalene houses were often named for her. Even though the association of Mary Magdalene with prostitution is not biblically accurate, historians still argue why this link stuck. Some say it was poetic license. Others believe the church needed a symbol of redemption it could control. Magdalene was useful. A familiar failure who, crucially, learned to keep quiet. You find a ledger near the front desk. Of course, another record. Everything in this world is documented. Inside are entries like Anna of the Quarry, 4th month of silence, still refuses needlework. Berta, formerly of St. George's Lane, baptized anew, assigned to laundry. Juliet, expelled for laughter. That last one makes you pause. Laughter, a quirky fact. Some Magdalene houses enforced silence periods that could last for months. The idea was to break down pride, restore humility. Some called it spiritual cleansing, others psychological warfare. You explore further. In one corner sits a small loom. Spools of thread gather dust. The women were expected to work, to sew, mend, wash, spin. It wasn't punishment. It was discipline. Redemption through repetition, the motto went. You think of all the hands that passed over this loom. How many stitched their way, through months of silence, waiting for someone to say they were whole again. But some didn't wait. In Rouen, a girl once escaped a Magdalene house by disguising herself as a novice nun and slipping out with a procession. She made it as far as the coast before being caught. Her punishment, public penance, then returned to the house. But the priest overseeing her noted in the margin, spoke with great intelligence, dangerous spirit. You move to a small courtyard in the center of the house, overgrown now, but you can still see the old garden beds. The herbs once grown here weren't just for cooking. They were for soothing bruises, easing childbirth, stopping bleeding. Yes, even in supposed sanctuaries, there were children. Some women gave birth here. The infants were usually taken, sometimes given to foundling hospitals, other times simply vanished. There's no official record of how many children were born inside Magdalene houses, but the rumors echo through time, and yet, not all stories ended in shadows. You find a loose board in one wall. Behind it, a tiny notebook. Inside, a woman's careful script. Daily prayers, yes, but also sketches. A bird, a laughing face, a house with smoke rising from the chimney. She dreamed of something else. Some women eventually left, through marriage, charity, or sheer endurance. Others lived out their days here, silent, obedient, erased. But in this little book, someone dared to imagine joy. You tuck it back, gently. The sun's shifting now, slanting across the courtyard. The stone warms beneath your feet. And for a moment, in this place of penance and paper, you feel something like peace. Not because the system was fair, but because even within its walls, someone remembered herself. You leave the Magdalene house as the afternoon deepens into that slow, golden hush that settles over the city just before dusk. Shadows stretch long across the road. Lanterns flicker to life, one by one. And you walk downhill now, toward the docks, toward the edge of town. This is where the rules fray, where church bells grow faint and the clamor of trade takes over. Sailors unload cargo. Crates slam. Barrels roll. And all around the scent of salt, sweat, and fish hangs in the air. And here, hidden in plain sight, are the foreign women. Because not all prostitutes in medieval towns were local girls. In fact, many were outsiders. Immigrants, refugees, runaways. Some trafficked. Some escaped. Most simply arrived. They clustered in port towns and border cities. Places like Marseille, Lubeck, Naples. Places that didn't ask too many questions. You pass a tavern where music drifts out the window. Strings plucked in an unfamiliar scale. A language you don't quite recognize. A woman leans on the door frame, dark eyes watching you as she smokes something sweet and pungent. She isn't wearing yellow. That rule doesn't always apply here. You step inside. The air is thick. Card games in one corner. A man nods at you with the weary authority of someone who's seen everything and still pours the ale. In the far corner, you hear laughter. 5 or 6 women seated around a table. One has bright red braids. Another wears layers of gauze in deep green. One speaks rapidly in Greek, another in Catalan. They notice you. They do not care. This is their world. You've entered what historians sometimes call the unlicensed porter. A floating realm of undocumented women, unregulated trade, and uneasy tolerance. Because the church might control the brothels in town, but here, the port answers to itself. That doesn't mean it's safer. Far from it. These women are often the most vulnerable. No legal protection, no license to work, no access to the Magdalene houses, and certainly no priest coming to hear their confessions. But they survive in other ways. Networks, shared meals, hidden codes. One quirky fact: some port cities develop secret token systems. Women would wear beads or ribbons that marked their allegiance to a particular gang, trader, or sailors' guild. not out of pride, but protection. A kind of silent insurance. She belongs to someone. Don't touch. You take a seat near the hearth, where a woman sits sewing a tear in her own hem. She glances up. Her accent is unfamiliar, but her voice is kind. She tells you she came from across the sea, promised work, ended up here. She shrugs. I eat, I sleep, I live, and sometimes, she adds, I dance. She does. Later that night, you stay longer than you meant to, watching as she spins barefoot across the floor. Her eyes are closed. The others clap, half-heartedly. No performance, just movement, just claiming space. Historians still debate whether the presence of foreign women in medieval prostitution was a cause or consequence of moral collapse. Some saw them as symptoms of urban decay. Others, more honest, saw them as convenient scapegoats for problems the church couldn't fix. You slip outside for air. The harbor glows under the moon. You walk past an old warehouse and spot graffiti scrawled into the wall. Latin, barely legible. Venit a longe, sed domum nemo dedit. She came from far away, but no one gave her a home. You stare at it a moment. Wind whistles through the rigging of nearby ships. Seagulls scream. You think of all the women who were labeled other, not for what they did, but for how they spoke, or dressed, or prayed. Some adapted. Some disappeared. Some carved poems into stone. You walk on, past the foreign quarter, past the lanterns, back toward town. The streets narrow again, but something has shifted. You've seen the rules, the loopholes, the masks people wear when power watches too closely. And now, just around the corner, the church is preparing for yet another inspection of virtue. But you've seen what's behind the doors, and the ledgers, and the smiles, and the silence. You rise early the next morning before the sun has warmed the cobblestones. The city feels paused, just for a breath, before another day of performance begins. But you don't head toward the square or the docks. This time, you take a narrow lane through the merchant quarter, where houses stack high and close like folded paper. You're here to visit someone different. Not a prostitute, not a priest, but a wife. Because while the church licensed sin and cities taxed it, the women who lived outside that world, wives, daughters, maidservants, watched all of this from very close range. And what they saw didn't always sit well. You reach a tidy house with whitewashed walls and painted shutters. A woman, Elspeth, she says, greets you at the door. She's in her 30s, plain dress, hair braided, sharp eyes. She invites you in. Her husband is away. Merchant work, Bruges maybe. She offers tea, then bread. The room is clean, if modest. You sit, she talks. She tells you that 2 doors down lives a public woman, licensed and marked. She's polite, Elspeth says, but too bold with her eyes. Then she pauses. She has money, though, new shoes every month, and her shutters are glass. Glass, a luxury, a statement. The jealousy creeps in. See, that's the part the church never really addressed. How sin and success often shared the same street. A prostitute could earn in a day what a washerwoman made in a week. And wives, especially poor ones, they noticed. Historians still argue whether this dynamic caused more judgment or more imitation. Some records suggest respectable women occasionally took in clients on the side during hard seasons. Discreetly, no licensing, no yellow ribbon, just opportunity. A quirky story from Lubeck. One local wife was caught entertaining sailors during her husband's frequent absences. She claimed it was for spice money. The bishop fined her, but then quietly asked her to pray for him. You glance around Elspeth's room. A small icon hangs above the hearth. A single silver ring rests in a bowl. She's devout, certainly, but her gaze lingers when she mentions how the yellow-cloaked girl eats fresh pears every morning. I would never, she says. But would she? That's the tension, the great contradiction. The medieval church taught that women's virtue was the cornerstone of society. Modesty, silence, obedience, and yet, at the very same time, it managed prostitution as a necessary evil, needed to protect other women from male temptation. So let's break this down. Wives were expected to be chaste, loyal, and tireless. But prostitutes, legally permitted, visibly marked, were expected to absorb the urges that theoretically a good wife should never encourage. In other words, the church built a system where one group of women suffered for the virtue of another. Elspeth mentions a neighbor again. She never goes to church, she says with a smirk. But her roof doesn't leak. Smirk. You finish your bread and thank her. As you step outside, you catch sight of the yellow-cloaked girl herself, just turning the corner. She carries a basket. Her cloak is velvet. Her posture, regal. And in her hand, yes, a ripe pear. You glance back. Elspeth is still watching. There's a quiet resentment that can only exist between women divided by morality, but united by powerlessness. Both are trapped in systems not of their making. One with rules she must obey. The other with rules she must perform. You turn down another street and hear two older women gossiping over water buckets. It's all rot, one says. She'll end in rags or the river. They say it like a curse, like a prophecy. But there's something else behind their tone. Fear, envy, a memory. After all, some of them once were her, or wanted to be, or still wonder what it would have felt like to choose. You head toward the city's outer edge now, toward the old mill road. The light is warm, golden, dust-speckled. You pass a crumbling fresco on a wall, weather-worn but still visible. It shows two women, one dressed plainly, holding a spindle. The other cloaked in gold, standing before a priest. Below them, a Latin phrase barely legible. Diverse paths, one judgment, or maybe one fate. You touch the wall gently, and for the first time, you wonder, what did the priest say when faced with both? The wife, the sinner. The system he served demanded that he bless one and forgive the other. But did he ever doubt who deserved more mercy? The road curls outward now, following the city's crumbling boundary wall. You walk in its shadow, where moss clings to the stones and weeds push through ancient cracks. Beyond lies open countryside, fields, orchards, the occasional shepherd waving lazily from a hillside. But just ahead, tucked along this forgotten edge, stands a low wooden building with a slate roof and a crooked chimney. Again, always the crooked chimney. This is not a brothel, not a chapel. not a home. This is a courtroom. Yes, even prostitution had its day in court, and you're just in time for the hearing. You step inside. A few wooden benches, a raised platform. The judge, a rotund cleric in faded robes, leans back in his chair, bored already. Beside him, a notary sharpens his quill. A bailiff sips something that definitely isn't water. And on the bench below, a woman in yellow. She stands straight, silent. Her name is Clara. Her crime? Working on a holy day, allegedly. The trial begins. A witness steps forward, a merchant's apprentice with a nervous twitch, claims he saw Clara entering a house on the feast of St. Bartholomew. Says it's common knowledge she works on forbidden days. Says she smiled at him. You watch Clara closely. She says nothing. The judge asks for her license. She produces a crumpled parchment from her sleeve. The seal is faded, but visible. A coin exchanges hands. The judge inspects it, shrugs. Still valid, he mutters. Another witness, this one a rival madam, claims Clara has been taking clients outside the assigned district. Scandalous, but no proof. Historians still debate whether these local trials served justice or simply reinforced hierarchy. The answer, as usual, depends on who was on the bench and who was on their knees. A quirky case from Ghent once involved two women suing each other for client theft. The judge ruled that both be fined, and then invited them to confess in tandem. No record exists of what happened next, but the notary doodled a heart in the margin. Back in the courtroom, the bailiff yawns. The judge rubs his temples. Clara finally speaks. I serve where I'm told. I rest when I'm allowed. I eat when I can. If that's a sin, so be it. The room stills. The judge blinks, then dismisses the case, but not without a warning. Renew your license within the month, he says, and keep your feet inside the red street. She nods once, then walks past you, head high. You follow her outside, through the gate, past a mural faded with time. It shows a woman, naked, kneeling, flanked by angels on one side, demons on the other. Each figure holds a scroll. Justice, apparently. Clara vanishes down a lane. You wonder where she'll go. Maybe back to her rented room. Maybe to a chapel, if she's in the mood for hypocrisy. Maybe to a tavern, to spend her trial fee on warm bread and cheap wine. You wander through the old legal quarter. On a wall, a stone plaque reads, "No woman is guilty for what she must do to live." It's cracked down the middle. Of course it is. Not every trial ended in dismissal. Some were cruel, public, humiliating. Fines, stocks, hair shorn in shame, and occasionally branding. In certain cities, convicted prostitutes were marked with ink or even hot iron, a small symbol, usually on the hand or shoulder, to warn others, to own them. You imagine the courtroom on those days, the gavel, the silence, the press of eyes. A woman once punished this way in Siena reportedly burned her mark off with oil and hot coins. No records say what happened to her next. Just a note, name lost, no burial recorded. So many names. Gone, You make your way back toward the cathedral square. Day is ending. The city changes tone again. Children called in for supper, bells chiming vespers, shadows growing long. And you feel the weight of the system now. Not just the church, not just the law, but the sheer architecture of control. Streets laid out to contain, rules designed to limit, mercy granted only when convenient. But still, within that system, women survived. They outwitted, endured, reshaped. They smiled through confession, danced in the margins, embroidered grace into the corners of ruin. And even now, if you listen closely, you can still hear their footsteps behind you. One woman on her way to court, another back from confession, another home with just enough coins to pay rent. Each story slightly different, but all of them real. You walk now with the hush of twilight at your back. The streets quieter, the city sighing into itself like an old book closing. The towers of the cathedral glow with reflected firelight, and somewhere a bell tolls one long, low note. You follow a familiar path through winding alleys, past shuttered stalls, under archways that once divided sacred from profane. But there's one last place to visit. Not a brothel, not a court, not even a church. A cemetery, because everyone eventually ends up here. You pass through its wrought iron gates, rusted and half-hinged, and step onto damp grass. It smells of earth and rain. Moss has overgrown half the stones. Some lean, some sink, some have no names at all. You're not here for saints or bishops. You're here for the forgotten. Because that's where many of these women, licensed, punished, pardoned, feared, ended. Not in family plots, not in sacred vaults, but in unmarked corners, beyond the view of processions, prayers, and public remembrance. The church had rules for burial, just as it did for living. Women who died unrepentant, especially prostitutes, were often denied burial in consecrated ground. Some were interred in sin plots outside the cemetery wall. Others were left to be claimed or not, but the lines were never clean. One record from Rouen notes a prostitute who, after years of work, gave all her earnings to a hospital. When she died, the nuns buried her in the cloister garden. No inscription, but they remembered her in prayer. Another tale from Prague tells of a woman buried at night, in secret, by a young monk who believed she had been more Christ-like than most priests. His superior exiled him. You walk further in. A patch of uneven ground draws your eye. No markers, just 3 small bundles of dried flowers. Someone still visits. You kneel. The soil is soft, the silence deep. And here's the truth the church never quite knew what to do with. Many of these women were deeply religious. They prayed. They confessed. They wept. They gave alms. They sang hymns through cracked windows while men fumbled with coin. One quirky fact: in Cologne, a 14th century brothel was found to have its own tiny chapel. Women lit candles before each night's work. One scrawled prayer survives on the wall behind the altar. Forgive what I must do, and let it be enough. You sit now beneath a tree, wind moving gently through its leaves. You think of the thousands, tens of thousands of women who passed through this system, some forgotten, some footnoted, a few named in trial records or city ledgers, but most whispers. They worked in rooms with one window and a door that locked only from the outside. They listened at confession while their priest coughed into his robes, afraid to look them in the eye. They saved coins under floorboards. They watched younger girls arrive and older ones disappear. They lived in a world that declared their bodies dangerous and necessary at once. Historians still debate how many of them chose the life, and how many simply had nowhere else to go. You lean back. The stars begin to emerge, one by one. And for the first time, maybe, you feel it fully. That strange medieval balancing act. A church that condemned sin while licensing it. A society that scorned women while needing them. And a history that wrote their stories only in margins. But you've walked the alleys now, seen the ledgers, watched the procession, sat through the trial, read the scribbled prayers. You know. And now, as your eyes begin to close, as the world softens into dream, you remember one last detail. A single record from Siena, a woman named Sophia. Her name appears only once. No age, no family, just this note. Paid her dues, never missed mass, died with a smile. And in that one line, so brief, so easily overlooked, you see the entire truth. She mattered. They all did. And now you breathe. Long, deep, even breaths. In and out. The night has folded itself around the city like a velvet cloak. The bells have fallen silent. The brothels have dimmed their lanterns. The courts are locked. The priests have finished their prayers. And in that quiet, just before sleep takes you fully, you carry something with you. A thread of stories, heavy and golden and strange. You remember the yellow cloaks and the whispered prayers, the flicker of incense behind closed doors, and the soft defiance of a woman who chose to dance, even when no one was watching. These were not saints, not sinners, not myths, just women, living inside a system that was never built to love them, but still they lived. So as your eyes grow heavier and the rhythm of the world slows around you, know this. History remembers kings and martyrs, crusades and creeds, but it also holds space for hands that stitched, for lips that whispered, for names spoken only once and barely heard. They were here, and now so are you. Rest easy. The streets are quiet now, and the story is told.